I'll say reporting in progress. So Joe Schilling, I'm with the Urban Institute and a long-standing member of the Smart Growth Network. I was kibitzing with my colleague and friend Harriet Trangoning. We figured out that it was probably the fall of 1997 when the first Smart Growth Network meeting was convened, and we were there. Old television series, and you are there at the first Smart Growth Network meeting.
Thank you, Joe. We old, yes.
But what I would say is that, you know, there was method to the madness with the Smart Growth Network, which was really to leverage the collaboration across agencies, which at times was new, across levels of government, across sectors, all trying to promote these concepts of smart growth, becomes sustainability, climate resilient development, all sort of aligned under that umbrella. So the network continues to be resilient, just like our EPA staff and friends who are also exceptionally resilient during these times. So we are confident that the Smart Growth Network will continue. So for those of you who don't know or have forgotten what the Urban Institute is, we used to be called the think tank. And some people may still call us the think tank, but in our mission, we are now a research to impact organization that equips change makers with evidence, of course. We're still a research organization to ensure that the policies and practices, and I would add a few more P's, like plans and programs, will improve and strengthen communities in more, and this is my adding, equitable and resilient ways. So we cover a wide range of research and policy domains: tax, health, education, the Housing and Communities Division, of which Peter and Kathy and Lee are part of, is probably the closest connection to smart growth, given the topics of transportation, affordable housing, and then my home is the Research to Action Lab. So we get the opportunity to go out and provide technical assistance, strategic guidance, or as I like to think of myself sometimes, it's like policy design, where we get to engage with communities and local governments, foundations and nonprofits around, you know, their efforts and initiatives dealing with smart growth. So I will introduce Kathy Pettit.
Yeah, if we can go over the virtual housekeeping,
Oh,
which I could do
housekeeping, okay.
too. We're gonna try to avoid lots of slides for people to sleep, but we have a couple of them. There we go. So this is just for the virtual folks. You could stay muted while you're not talking to help with the background noise. We are recording this webinar and this will be posted on the Smart Growth Network website. Right? For closed captioning, you can click on the three dots at the bottom if that's helpful to you. Please enter questions throughout the presentation through the chat. We'll be alternating between the hybrid and in-person questions later on. And if you're on the virtual piece and have any technical problems, send an email to Catherine, your virtual hostess on this piece.
And Catherine, are you going to answer any questions they might have or just about the technical ones? If they got a question about smart growth, will you answer it instantaneously?
You know, we have a great community on the chat who will all jump in instantaneously. But yeah, I can both chat about anything that you need for the virtual programming or share resources as appropriate.
Okay. So I introduced you to the Urban Institute and the Smart Growth Network. So now I will introduce you to Kathy Pettit, who is a senior fellow and co-director here with her partner in crime, Leah Henley, of the National Neighborhoods Indicator Partnership, NNIP. When I first came to Urban, I had no idea what NNIP was. I did know about the original founder, Tom Kingsley, because he was sort of a giant in the neighborhood change field. But it also shows what I would say is the versatility of the Urban Institute. So we're not just researchers, we do a fair amount on research translation, but we also know that when you're trying to advance policy change, you need good stories, and data can often help you tell a compelling story for change. But one last tidbit before I turn it over to Kathy is that she has strong smart growth roots. Found out that she has been awarded, she is within the top 10% of metro riders here in Washington, DC. I think that is very.
You don't know. Anyway, Ramada has your annual report. I'll do a sales pitch. I can add, we can put that in the chat.
Fun.
It's kind of like Spotify where they do that
Yeah.
annual, like, here's your listening.
Wow.
So anyway, I mean, as you can tell, I think that's an impressive commitment to smart growth.
Or I just don't like driving. One or the other. There. Thanks very much, Joe. It's very exciting to see all of you after getting to know the network, and thank you to all those many hands that put this meeting together, and I'll get to this.
Kathy, are you sharing your video? Sorry to interrupt.
Am I sharing my video? I thought my video is.
Okay, good. We got you.
Yeah, you're okay.
All right. And you can unspotlight the room, Vivian. Our Vivian is my colleague who's helping on the virtual side too. So if we give pieces, excellent. So you're going to hear from amazing panelists today, but we wanted to give you a quick overview of sort of our experiences that inspired the panel and why Joe came to us in the first place. This is super fast, so I'm happy to connect with any of you later to talk in more detail or afterwards for those people in person. Hopefully you can join us on the roof. So the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, which is a little cumbersome, but we haven't decided, we're going to stick with the name, helps local communities use data to shape investments so that all neighborhoods are places where people can thrive. And we're about 30 years old. Founded originally by some local coalitions that came to the Urban Institute and asked us to host their peer learning network and to share the model with others. So the network consists of organizations in 31 places, and they do the on-the-ground work of knowing their nonprofits, philanthropy, government agencies, and helping them both figure out what data they need to answer their questions and provide the sort of hands-on help and partnership to get that data into use. They are really trusted, long-term embedded organizations. It is not a time-limited project, but they have taken this on as their mission. And the Urban Institute is the partner for the Washington, DC area. You'll hear more about Peter's work in a little bit. We're very fortunate to be able to have these local ties as well as our national research. And as you can tell from the map, we are interested in growing right now too, and to see how the model can be adapted in other places. So I know lots of you have national connections, or those folks definitely who are attending virtually. We'd love leads if you are interested in learning more later. So that's what the local partners do, but together we've taken on to really share what we know. So across 36 cities, 30 years, we know a lot about how to get data into the hands of the right people and get it used to improve housing in the environment and early childhood development, and trying to share that with groups like you and other issue area groups has been an increased focus in our strategic plan for the last couple of years. So we were really excited to have this opportunity. And in addition to, so we know a lot about that, we have a lot of experts domain-wise, but we also know a lot about how to build a culture of data practice across communities in general. And we also have a focus on sort of the principles of using data to advance equity. That's there. So more general topics in addition to the issue area ones. So a few years back, we developed a framework. I'll give credit to our San Antonio partner, Laura McKernan, who started to ask, like, what do communities need to use data well? Like, what makes a community good at using data? We saw this happen across years as NNIP partners really cultivated this 5, 10, 15, up to 30 years later. Those places were like qualitatively different in how they looked at data. And we wanted to provide a framework on that so people could both look at strengths and gaps and figure out where to invest, and particularly encouraging philanthropy to invest in community data capacity. And I can share the brief with you afterwards in the follow-up note. And for us, community means everyone. So we need government agencies using data well, nonprofits, philanthropy, and regular people comfortable with understanding and interpreting data. And how those sectors interact, which is what you're gonna hear this amazing panel about, is really sort of the magic of how cities get better together. That's there, people can break out of their silos. That's when the connections start to happen and everybody gets lifted up. So the first component, I won't go through all of these, but it's, I think, what most people think of when they think of the data barriers. Sort of, we need access to the data. Like, how do I get to the website? How do I download the from the open data portal or the government websites? And then also getting help using the data, which is the NNIP focus too, whether that's deep technical assistance or just ad hoc, or formal data training and curriculum that happens. So all of this is necessary as sort of a foundation, but it's really not sufficient. There's a whole set of what we call skills and practices, and some of them, I think the first two are more familiar. So individual level includes both crunching, our programmers, but also the domain specialty, data ethics we put at the individual level. And even organizational, I think, is pretty familiar about nonprofits doing performance management or doing program evaluations, building up their culture of using data within a single organization. And the piece that we really focus on that's new to most people is this collective side of it, which is, what are people doing together? So we are demonstrating the benefits of a peer learning community. There are peer learning communities just around data that hold Data Day celebrations that I know are fun, I promise. And or they might, have a webinar once a month that hold people together. So it's both the peer learning communities, it's the investments that a place makes in data infrastructure and learning, whether that's public, private, or philanthropic. And then also data sharing goes into that group. So that collective piece is one that we focus on a lot in NNIP as something that people don't always recognize as missing from a place, because they think the organization is good at using data, and that's enough. So I'll send a link around to the brief with all those pieces and move on to the fun part of this session and stop sharing my screen. So you are all so lucky to have this amazing panelist session ahead of time. Our pre-call, they already started like chatting and getting around. I think we have 3 folks who really have lots of on-the-ground experience in helping their communities use data and seeing the payoff and overcoming the challenges of that. So we have 3 panelists today. Dr. Elizabeth Ackley is the professor and director of the Center for Community Health at Roanoke College, who I met through a connection with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Michael Moser is at the Vermont State Data Center and Center for Rural Studies, a research project specialist at the University of Vermont. And then my colleague, Peter, is a senior fellow and directs our Urban Greater DC as a research director. And we've included their bios in the agenda so we can save time for the conversation that's there. And we were also excited, you never know when panels are coming together, but also to be able to see if there are differences between a rural, small town, urban area, and those kinds of experiences, or institutionally that's there. So with that, thank you, Vivian. This is great. If you could, I think it's mostly spotlighted. That's there. So and I will try to also look at the right places here, looking at the hybrid pieces. So I think we'll just start with a few questions and then leave about half questions, half Q&A at the end. So keep those in mind. And to start with, just I wanted to ask each of them to provide one example of a partnership with data to give people a more concrete sense of this work, since community capacity data means a lot of things, capacity means a lot of things. So to give a example from their own community to get us started. So Liz, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So you see in my bio, I'm actually an exercise scientist. So I come to this work bringing a systems thinking approach. A great example of a recent win for us, we developed a $40 million resource hub that includes full service grocery retail, wellness space, an adult high school, and financial services all in one location in a low income, low access community. And the role of data there, I've really been for the last 10 years trying to build our community's data capacity so that every decision that was made along the way toward the development of this hub came from residents. So I sort of sit as the neutral person in the middle because I'm at an organization that is viewed as very non-threatening. Roanoke College is an undergraduate only institution. And we collect data through the public school systems using mixed methods so we can understand child health outcomes and family perceptions of barriers and access to facilitators to healthy living. That data was leveraged to help organizations, cross-sector partners really come together around the shared vision of community, and then was used to drive innovative investment strategies to bring this thing to life.
Great. We'll hear more about it, I'm sure, as well. Probe some more. Michael, do you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. I am a research specialist at the University of Vermont at a really small research shop called the Center for Rural Studies. And we work across sectors with different clients on different projects that are usually finite in time and timelines. So we do community health needs assessments with hospitals in the state. We just concluded a civic health in the state of Vermont project with the National Conference on Citizenship and the Secretary of State's office here in Vermont. And we have ongoing work in well-being with the International Society of Quality of Life Studies, the well-being metrics, youth well-being projects, broadband indicator projects. We work with regional planning commissions around the state of Vermont and other organizations to identify some of their indicator data needs and do process together. We're typically facilitating indicators process where we're utilizing existing frameworks, domains, et cetera, and then working with our clients and the stakeholder representatives to identify additional indicators, look at what indicators might be missing where we don't have data, and develop research design and methodology to develop data to complement whatever existing indicators and data are out there. And we have a lot of fun doing that. I'm not necessarily, I'm a subject matter expert in well-being data, but certainly not a subject matter expert in many of the projects that we work on. And so it's always fun to learn more and work with others to help them learn more about some of the data processes that we employ with them. Thanks.
Great. Peter?
Yeah, thank you. It's great to see you all here and those of you online. So I'm Peter Tatyan. As was said, I'm a senior fellow here at Urban Institute. I'm also research director for Urban Greater DC, which is part of the NIP network and is our effort to focus on things happening in our home city and region. I also work very closely with Leah Hendy, who's here, on that work as well. So we do work with a lot of local partners in this area, in the nonprofit space and in local government. I'm going to talk about a particular effort that's been a long-term effort we've had with the 11th Street Bridge Park, which is a project of a nonprofit organization building bridges across the river, which is working to bring equitable access to health, arts, and economic opportunity for residents of DC living east of the Anacostia River. And so I'll talk more about that as we get into the conversation.
Great. And I think the other piece is sort of why do this? Sort of you can have community organizing, and we know that there's political work that needs to be done and fundraising work that needs to be done, and sort of what does data add to the conversation, to these initiatives, and how does that add power? Peter, do you want to keep going on the 11th Street Bridge?
Sure, happy to do that. So to set the context for the Bridge Park, let me tell you a little bit more of the background. So for those of you who may not be entirely familiar with DC, the Anacostia River, which cuts through the city, has in recent times been not only a physical but also an economic and social barrier that separated neighborhoods on the east side of the river from the rest of the city. And the neighborhoods east of the river, which have been predominantly Black for decades, have suffered from a lack of investment for many years. They experienced a great deal of population loss in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. That's changed since DC began a period of renewed and sustained growth starting in the late 1990s. So we've been seeing more investment and economic activity happening east of the river. And while, in my estimation, it still lags behind the rest of DC, the changes there still are, fueling some concerns about gentrification and possible displacement. So, enter the Bridge Park. This project, which was initially proposed by a former director of the DC Office of Planning, hi Harriet, in around 2011, would repurpose a retired highway bridge that spans the river into a public park. And we're seeing more of these kinds of projects around the country where old pieces of infrastructure that aren't being used for their original purpose are now being repurposed into public space. We call them sometimes infrastructure reuse projects. And so this project is a literal bridge, but it has also cast itself as a symbolic bridge that can join the east of the Anacostia River neighborhoods with the neighborhoods on the west side. And the west side neighborhoods have themselves undergone a really radical transformation with a lot of new development in recent years. So in developing this idea for the Bridge Park, the people involved, and principal among them, Scott Kratz, who's been the director of the project since the very beginning, we're very aware of some of the experiences with other development projects where good intentions led to some negative consequences for existing residents. So developments like Bridge Park can attract a lot of interest, can attract other investment, which can be valuable, but that can also contribute to gentrification pressures and displacement pressures that I mentioned earlier. So the Bridge Park team decided first to go to the communities on both sides of the river and ask them if this was something that they wanted to see happen. And that was a very important and, in my experience, exceptional first step to do that. And through over 200 community conversations, they got a positive response. And that initial outreach also served as a launch pad for ongoing community engagement and input on the effort that has continued to this day. The second thing they decided was to create an equitable development plan, and this is where urban comes in. Myself and another colleague here, Brett Theodos, served on the task force that helped advise on the Bridge Park's first equitable development plan. That plan initially addressed issues of affordable housing, small business development, and workforce development. The plan has since gone through several iterations and is actually now called the Community Preservation Plan. and has been expanded to include other topics like cultural preservation and health equity. But by having this public document, I think this plan really served as the basis for their work going forward, and this was another key step. So in addition to advising on that initial plan, another role that Urban played is as a research partner for the Bridge Park on their actual plan implementation. So we first provided some data on communities on both sides of the future Bridge Park to help them understand what the current conditions were. But we also worked with the Bridge Park and their partners to develop a results framework, including a logic model and metrics that they could use to track progress. So I think this is where, you know, the skills and practices that Kathy talked about kind of come into it. And we view our role as not just being providers of data, but also we lend our expertise to these efforts. And so as part of our role there, we also wrote a series of reports and briefs that describe the work that Bridge Park was doing. And you can read all about those, read those on our project page, which we'll share after today's meeting. And one, you know, key thing I want to share from one of our reports, and this was from 2021, that the Bridge Park leaders secured more than $77.5 million to invest directly in the park surrounding neighborhoods through the equitable development strategies. And at that time, that was more than the $59 million they had raised for building the actual park. So I mean, think about like how significant that is. They raised more money for equitable development than for the actual infrastructure project they were doing. And I think that's a real credit to the work they've done. So I'll stop here and we can talk more about some of the specifics later.
I think one thing you'll see as they all speak is really that these are not transactional, like someone hired someone to do a report and they passed it on and walked away. This is all, the relationships are really the beautiful part and the strength of the community. Liz, would you like to give your angle on the question about how the data added to the initiative?
Yeah, and I think something may be different for folks who are in mid-sized to smaller cities and maybe even rural communities, where what we experience in Roanoke, Virginia, there's not a developer at the table with a concept. And so I loved, Peter, hearing that story because it sounded like you had a champion developer that then used data to support, you know, the needs to make this even bigger than imagined in the beginning. In a mid-sized city like Roanoke, we often don't have a developer on a table. And so sort of the role that I play and the way that we like to think about data here now is using data as the driver, not only to guide projects, but also to invite developers to the table. And what I love about this approach, where data really is the first step, we've used it to understand the lay of the land, really from a health equity standpoint, from a resource standpoint. And we had the honor of participating in the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Invest Health National Cohort Initiative. And really the aim of that initiative of Invest Health was to try to figure out innovative investment strategies to mitigate generations-long health disparities. And we were tasked with starting with residents. So to understand what the health equity needs of are the community, and then to really hear that from residents, we began collecting data, learning about lived experiences from individuals, what neighborhood needs actually were, so that our community development projects were driven first by those conversations. And being able to drive that conversation directly from residents also allowed us then to use that data to drive our strategy development to overcome the barriers that we were hearing. It also drove us to understand how to build a partnership so that we could effectively pull together organizations, individuals, and government representatives to help us get exactly what we needed for the implementation strategy that we were putting together, again, directly from the data. And it helped us tease out what resources we could build from each other. And then that collaborative drove the implementation itself. So across all phases, it was a data first approach catalyzing something else. So the data was the driver for every element. And what I've really learned to love about this is two things, because many of you are in organizations that have limited capacity. The first is that type of process where the data is driving phased work enables organizations to ebb and flow in their involvement in the work. So they are providing resources and supporting, you know, the implementation when it suits them, when it fits the needs, the skills, and the resources of that organization. But also what it does is it makes sure that the work is not beholden to a single organization's mission. And so instead, you have organizations and individuals who are leveraging their mission and resources in service to a common goal, rather than serving their organization level mission by participating in an implementation strategy. And so it's really inviting individuals and organizations outside of their silos so that there is this perspective or this paradigm shift that we're all sort of working toward a common goal, and we don't have to be involved at every phase. And the data is what is allowing that sort of to come together.
And like, when did that all start, Liz, just to give people a sense of time?
Yeah, okay, so time is also important. So actually, that was a limitation that I wanted to mention. I am aware that allowing data to drive processes does take a long time. So we've been working toward the development of this resource hub called Melrose Plaza, if you'd like to look it up. We've been working toward this for 9 years. But what I love about the process is along the way, we have introduced residents to data, how to find it, how to tell stories from that data, and how to tell compelling stories so that they're actually the ones that are getting investors to the table. We also taught partners how to use that data and then engage community partners in the process to tell different stories. Along the way, we use data to get technical assistance that we need to build real estate plans. Residents actually built the architectural renderings for this, and then they pitched to the city for the ARPA money that we needed for the seed funding to bring Melrose Plaza to life. So at every step of the way, data was used to convene folks, make decisions, and position residents to be the actionable players. Had we had a developer, or had we had someone come to the table with funding, I think then if you've got short-term deadlines and you're running off of a fiscal year, this process probably doesn't work very well. So that's something to keep in mind. And I am completely cognizant of the fact that that's how grant funding works on timelines.
Thanks.
Can I correct something, maybe the misapprehension that Liz might have? There isn't a developer for the 11th Street Bridge project. It's a nonprofit, and it's taken 12 years to get to a place where there's even a groundbreaking. So a lot of the points you made, I think, are very similar. So yeah, I just wanted to
no,
correct
that's
that.
helpful. But don't be, you can make a lot of progress. There sounds like there's a lot of interim wins. You don't need to wait for 10 years to get any wins either.
Yeah, and I'll just respond to that.
Yeah.
That this hub, this wasn't a vision that we imposed. This wasn't a vision we created. And so this wasn't, you know, that sounded like a project that had a vision. So this vision actually drove from data from the ground up.
Nice. Michael, let's bring you into the conversation. Sort of, I think Liz just talked about bringing, you know, teaching residents and the groups that she's working with to use data to move things. Do you want to talk a little bit about how do people find you, and how do your collaborations sort of both get the job done that they came to you for, answer those questions, but also equip them to answer the questions they have next month?
Yeah, sure. So thank you. We're definitely a different model and coming at this from a vastly different perspective. I don't have any 9-year or 12-year projects, or you know, projects that are going to go on forever, hopefully. We really are a transactional research center where we're working to serve the needs of particular clients around data and around data process, and ideally, usually trying to turn anecdote into knowledge, right? So like with margins of error attached or whatever. And so, you know, these projects are 1 year, 2 years that we work on typically. And so I think what I'd like to do is focus a little bit on the process that we use, which is, you know, building stakeholder doing a stakeholder development process right off the bat with clients, determining how we're going to have governance over the data that we're selecting and how we're going to ensure that we're being as inclusive as possible with the data process. So ensuring that stakeholders, representatives are at the table, folks that are subject matter experts, organizational representatives, and community members all sitting together at the table, talking about, we typically start with a conversation about, what are the things that you want to know? What are the things that you need to know? We typically come to the table ourselves with examples of frameworks that can be used, like OECD or CDC or NCOC types of domains and indicator sets that we utilize and teach the stakeholders from various, again, organizations and the general population about how we can, about, the methodologies we might use and the frameworks that we might use to develop a data process. And so I think that's really important, particularly having stakeholders at the table. I've found that, teaching organizations, and this goes back to us being a very small population center. The state of Vermont has 645,000 people total. And so everything we do is small, although to us it's not. But we're working with small organizations, we're working with small communities, and we're working with limited human resources. So the subject matter experts are few and far between. A lot of people wear many hats, and the folks that we pull in that are stakeholder representatives may not have any data knowledge at all. And so we build that capacity by talking about frameworks, showing examples of frameworks, and then we sit everyone down and we say, as I mentioned, what do we need to know here? What are we trying to understand? And we'll start by sort of dumping all of those indicators or all of those questions or all of those lines of inquiry into a big spreadsheet. And we try to identify indicators that match some of those questions, or just outright identify indicators. And then we look at those indicators, and part of again, it's a group process where we work to understand the quality of each of these indicators. Is the indicator timely? Is it, does it really indicate what we're trying to develop knowledge about? So we ask these questions, and we work with the stakeholder organizations and individuals to refine these indicator sets. We start with this, I call it the wide end of the funnel. And then we narrow down the indicators so that we're not duplicating, so that we're, identifying the highest quality indicators that we can get. And also from that process, we work with the organizations to identify data that they may have internally that they never have used before in many cases, or data that we can bring to the table as a research shop. We do statewide survey research on a pretty regular basis, so statewide data collection on well-being, and we use our well-being indicators with all sorts of clients all the time, which is really fun to see it being used in those ways. And so we will gather up the organization's data, our data, whatever existing data is, federal data sets or statewide data sets, et cetera, and determine which questions are still unanswered by the existing data, and then we'll develop the methods to go out and collect, whether it be quantitative data or qualitative data, subjective data, objective data. We do all of that work to fill the gaps, the data gaps that exist. And we work in partnership with our organizations and stakeholders to do that work. So we're training stakeholders to conduct focus groups, for example, and we're working in partnership with them. And again, this is over a year, 2 years at most for most of our work. So we're building data capacity across organizations and across stakeholders from communities. They're doing the data collection in partnership with us. We'll even work with them to analyze the data, and then we triangulate all of those indicators, whether it be qualitative, quantitative data, and secondary and primary data. So, you know, we can look at the existing indicators, and then we find it really useful to match up some of the quantitative data with the qualitative sort of like storytelling, right? So what are the really you know, powerful quotes or stories that we hear from the stakeholders or the organizations that are relevant to what the data, the trend analyses and comparative analyses are telling us, right? So we want to give that extra spin and that extra sort of flavor on the data, and that's represented in our reports and our reporting that we do with the clients that we work with. So we really lean on that sort of mixed methods approach. And you know, I think I could stop there. I could talk about some of the outcomes of that.
I think if you pause, I kind of, and then we'll leave time for questions. I'm sure the other pieces will come out.
Yeah, sure.
I think I had one round of closing question, and then we can open it for Q&A. And I have some other questions if other people don't have questions. If you're virtual, if you could put your questions in the chat for the people, that would be great. So I think we gave them a list of the backgrounds of the, you know, your organizations, of all the folks that registered. And I know some folks are national, some are local people, some research, some from the more subject area angle that's coming from climate or other different topics. So we asked each of the folks to think about one piece of advice that if in your organization, what advice would they give other organizations that were trying to connect community initiatives with local research institutions in whatever place you happen to be working in? So it's a very broad question. We'll see what kind of advice we get from which side. Will you get a favorite framework? Will you get a favorite software? Or so if you want to start, Peter, with your advice, was it about people? Is it about the data? Any of it's fair game?
Yeah, I think it's about the process you use, and to correct just one thing, you know, I might have given the impression that we've been working constantly with Rich Parks for 14 years, which is not the case. So I mean, we also are very, I don't like to use the word transactional, but like we have discrete opportunities to work with people on a particular thing.
Right.
And but we've been able to, yeah, it's intermittent, but we've been able to kind of build on that over time. So that's a nice thing about it too. But to me, then one of the key things from the community group side is to be clear about your goals and what's important to you. And the data and research should serve those priorities, and your research partner should align to them. Now that doesn't mean you should be stubbornly fixed on a particular way of looking at things, and sometimes data can open our eyes to new things and new ways of thinking about it. So it's good to be flexible, but you know, starting with the community needs, and that's what should drive the work.
Great. Liz, you want to jump in?
Sure. I think one of the most fun things to see in our community is who the data organizations are. And so given how diverse this group of attendees are, I would recommend that you look beyond the traditional R1 institution or the traditional land grant research institution as your primary outlet maybe for research support. And the reason is they're often very expensive. If you've got smaller organizations or even liberal arts colleges like Roanoke College, where I'm from, you've got access to a bunch of faculty who are similarly trained, but who don't have the same stress to publish. And so we're often going to collect research that's not for an output or a product related to a publication or even a grant. We can, work toward an impact that is, infrastructure or policy change without having this academic driver. And I think that sometimes makes for better quality data, particularly when you're trying to gather lived experiences from residents. It makes the trust factor a whole lot simpler.
Michael, you want to give some advice?
Sure, yeah, coming from an academic institution that is just recently dubbed an R1 institution. Yay for us, for UVM. But but seriously, our little research shop, the Center for Rural Studies, is actually we're staff only. There's no faculty. There's some faculty oversight, but we are extremely applied, and you can find those in academic institutions, though I think they're rare. I think my piece of advice goes back to what I was talking about, this sort of stakeholder process and engagement. I think it's really important. I always find that I learn a lot from stakeholders and from community members, whether or not I think I know the subject matter or not going into a project. That the crowdsourcing process is really important, and it can be messy and challenging, but and take time. But I think it's really valuable. You learn new information and you learn new perspectives, and it helps me to learn. Working with stakeholders, community representatives, helps me to learn what their data needs are as far as being able to access and utilize the data. So these are non-experts that come to the table, and I think I spend a lot of time making data easier to access, simplifying concepts, terminology, visualizations, those types of things, so that you're making it more accessible to a greater audience. And I think that's really important. And then, of course, when those stakeholders become more data informed and become more data educated, they can spread the good word of data and become more active participants in their communities and in the projects that we're doing. So I think stakeholder engagement is really key, and ensuring that those folks are at the table and are part of the process is super important.
Fantastic. I'll pause for a minute if there are questions for any of the folks in the room, or examples that you have. And online, if you would put it in the chat too. Try to double check them.
Well, I'll ask a question. I'm imagining myself as like a small community that doesn't quite know where to start. And it was like, I think I have data needs. I mean, what would you recommend is the first step for a community like that, to kind of say, how can I gather more information? Like, is there a place, like, is your network a place for them to call, or is there, like, should they be going straight to their local, like, university? Where's the first place for them to go?
Naturally, and it's just like, what's your hat? Like a community group or neighborhood?
Say a local
association?
government,
Yeah,
right? Like a small local government.
that's there. Well, definitely, NNIP has a lot of examples, I think, of what can be used, but we don't have a national directory necessarily. We do have a list of like likely places that can help you get started. Including, to your point, Liz, on the non-traditional side, like the Federal Reserve Community Development branches do a lot of great work and have a lot of capacity. I think just telling people to go to the university is a hard one, because obviously they're like a monolithic institution, although Roanoke might be smaller, that it's, somebody there. But do you guys have ideas of, in a given theoretical town in the middle of the country, where to start? How would they find you all? Michael, how do people find you from Vermont?
Well, I mean, we're like 2 degrees of separation in Vermont, so that's not really a fair question for anyone else. But it is, I mean, that is the case across rural places, which are the primary amount of land in this country, right? We know most of this country is rural. And so, low population density, and there's interpersonal connectivity that occurs in those types of places. I think that's useful. I think our university, University of Vermont, is really actively engaged in doing outreach and being a community partner with communities and trying to provide data services. So that may be unique for us. I think also I coordinate our census state data center for the state of Vermont. Every state in the country has a state data center. I act as a liaison between the Census Bureau and data users. I'm always out doing data trainings and outreach. And so there are people like me doing that as part of YMCA or community foundation organizations or state data centers. And, you know, so I think that's, you know, word of mouth is one way, I think, especially in rural places. Yeah.
Liz, you wanted to jump in?
I did, because I think there's some really easy on-ramps. So we just did a whole lot of data capacity building in Roanoke using City Health Dashboard. If your city is on that dashboard, what I love about it is there are very diverse indicators that can be mined very granularly, and that data set is updated regularly. So you can get information like you would get through NNIP.
Yeah.
I would also ask you, who are your conveners? So who are the coalitions that already exist and are working towards something? Those folks are going to have access to data, and they're going to have access to people who might be able to access data. So I think dashboards are easy tools. You can just Google and find them. Knowing who your conveners already are. And then, okay, you mentioned city government. So I think city planners are the unsung hero of all things data and convening. So I work with our city planning team all the time because they tend to have their thumb in everything in a really good way. They know who neighborhood leaders are, and they also know who community leaders are who have access to data. And if the question is how folks find me, well, I send a survey home to every family through the public school system every 3 years, and I'm collecting data that provides us with objective metrics of child health, objective metrics, and then we can use GIS technology to map that to residential addresses. And then we hear subjectively from each family, what are the barriers the family experiences and how would they like to see those barriers overcome? I make that data public. So people know me because I'm sending things through the school system, but also the data is online open access for folks once it's aggregated, so it's safe. The planning team would know how to find me, and so would our coalitions. And so I would say, go to those entities first. They'll be a good springboard.
Our friends here from the Association of Geographers are happy to see the geocoding plug on the that came up.
We'd love you to also do remote sensing, but you do not have the satellite access, so.
That'll be the next quarterly meeting.
Yeah.
I would like to- I would love to attend. Other questions? Yeah.
A question about capacity buildings.
State your name and who
sorry.
you're from. Where are you from?
Joe
I'm sorry.
Griffiths, Maryland Department of Planning.
A planner.
So we don't have planning and zoning authority, so we're usually helping jurisdictions that do, and we're all about capacity building. So my question is, do you have an example or a method for, say you create, or part of your work with your clients or your work with, you create a new indicator, something that isn't previously tracked, it's tailored to that project, they can't just go to the Census Bureau or some other source, but you create it for this project because it's gonna be an ideal indicator to measure the desired outcomes. When your time is done with them, or you're diminished, what's an example of where you built capacity where your clients or those stakeholders could then track that new indicator independently of you when it's done? Because that's something that, you know, we would have struggle with. We could work with somebody during the project, and if something's already regularly tracked, they can do it. But if it's unique and new, how can you build that capacity to help them do it?
Sort of sustainability
Sustainability,
beyond
yeah.
your health.
It's a very targeted, specific question, no examples.
I feel like you have like, yeah, something in your back pocket there. I mean, to be honest with you, I'm not sure I would do that.
No?
Like
Okay.
if I really thought that was something that it was important that they continued using it and they needed me to continue using it, I'd think twice about like suggesting that. Now, without more specifics, it's hard to say. I mean, when you say something new, does that mean like you have to actually go out and gather the data yourself because
Primary
it
data.
doesn't like exist in a Census Bureau file somewhere that you can, that kind of thing?
It could be something new like that. some qualitative data they're tracking, or it could be something that you've combined other data sets or data into something that is a new measurable, but that would require continued amalgamation combination beyond the life of the project, or to continue monitoring it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I don't know that I have actually an example where, because again, I think if that was what was important, I might try to do something that was a little different so that it would be sustainable.
I'll briefly say, you know, I work with a lot of organizations, again, going back to the small sort of perspective. These small organizations that I work with, they don't necessarily have the resources to do data process within their organization or to do it to its best capacity. But I do spend a lot of time doing trainings around data process in your organization and just thinking about what data you have available and how you might utilize that better, and integrating new data processes into your organization so that it's almost like a train the trainer. You're training someone at that organization to be responsible for that indicator or that process, right? And they're working within the organization to do that internal advocacy as well, so that it becomes part of the business processes of the organization. I don't know if that's a canned response or not, but that's what we've done.
It does seem like also leaving the documentation really clear and behind, so that maybe like a graduate student intern can help now. So being that sort of what's the left behind piece. But I think the question of like, how do people keep going if you're not there to help every minute is a big one. Liz, you have a example?
I was gonna say with Melrose Plaza right now, we've got so many new resources going into this neighborhood. It's gonna transform all kinds of factors. And so we're in the middle of building an impact framework. And we started by asking residents, when this is built, what do you think it's gonna do for people, for the neighborhood, and for the city? And so we're building indicators to feed into all of the priorities they've identified. And so Peter's caveat to, I don't know that I would do that, is probably a really smart one. But is it possible that the thing that you have built actually feels like something one of your partners is already collecting? So when we're thinking about the sustainability of this impact framework, we're going to be building a hub and spoke model of data collection, where we're leaning on partners who are already collecting data that could serve as indicators for these outcomes that we're interested in. And those partners are already, they already have data capacity to be collecting certain points of data. And so is this outcome you're interested in something that could be tweaked just ever so slightly so that it speaks to something that one of your partners might already be collecting?
Do you have an example from your own experience where you had to leave but you felt bad about leaving somebody in the lurch?
I don't know if I have a specific example of what I was asking, because I think my example would probably be more towards, it would probably, really, the examples that I deal with on a day-to-day basis would be more existing data and how to access it and how to, and to analyze it.
Yeah.
Like, you know, we also have the State Data Center for Maryland in our office, and, you know, we kind of live by the idea that we're going to present the data but not interpret it for you. But that interpretation is always what everybody wants. That interpret, and whether or not that's a new indicator or not, how do you maintain that? Because you can help them interpret it in the moment, but then the next time they need to update the plan or do something else, they're coming back to you. And we have limited capacity just like anybody else. I like to train the trainer, or the idea of deciding on when you're considering the indicators in the front end, understanding what the capacity is and limiting yourself to that.
Helpful. I think thinking about how often they move too, like, you know, if the indicator isn't gonna, you actually like, you don't need it quarterly, you know, it's not, or depending on what, like how, the nature of the indicator, I think. But Harriet has a input.
Well, I just have a question. Does Maryland still do a circuit rider program for low capacity communities?
The Department of Housing Community Development does, but it's always limited in its funding. They have a town manager, circuit rider program, and then there's critical areas has one too.
You used to have one at planning for, especially when communities didn't have a zoning ordinance or they hadn't done a comprehensive plan. But that's actually a really good opportunity to
Yeah.
set up a data framework and teach people how to use it.
That's there. I think there's, I can put a plug in. The Urban Institute does have some automated tools like the spatial equity analysis that people can upload data and get the analysis back. So to the extent where there is some fancier web development on the other side that can do some automation. And then that tool is available, you know, when they want to upload the data in 6 months. But Joe, did you have a input on that?
Well, it seems what we're grappling with is this, like you start to scale and capacity build, right? So, you know, using Yvonne's example of local government, right? So here's a project and we use the data. There's another project that has another indicator. And then if you're the town manager or the council, you're like, oh, like, you know, we're using data in different ways. How do we build that capacity? And now a smaller town doesn't have the capacity to have its own, you know, chief information officer. But yeah, then it's trying to figure out, you know, are there organizations, you know, is there assistance at the state? But it is more of that kind of program design that is then, you know, that can evolve and apply different indicators, you know, for different projects.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of natural evolution.
Yeah, and thinking about the reuse. Other questions or folks on the, I do see there are virtual folks on there.
Okay, while folks are thinking, Kathy, what was the name of the tool that Urban has where you can upload data?
I might have the name exactly. I might have the order of the words, but the like spatial data equity tool.
Okay, thanks.
I can put that in the link in the follow-up, email.
I just want to make sure it's in the note. Yeah, thanks.
Spatial equity data analysis tool?
I know.
There's definitely
There's
data.
words in there. Yeah.
Are there other common challenges that you all have encountered that you've looked up for trying to do this work in partnership with community around using data and applying it?
Yeah, plenty.
Oh, wait, pick one maybe, not all.
Well, I'll stick to the challenge of the data themselves, right? So it's just, you know, timeliness data, you know, from different sources are varying degrees of quality. They are, you know, replicated at different on different timelines. And so if you're trying to develop sort of a comprehensive index or indices with sets of indicators, that can be very challenging to find data that are all sort of running along the same timeline. And also there are always indicators that you're looking for that, or looking at, that are adjacent to what you're trying to measure, and they may not measure, or they may not take into account all the factors that you're trying to measure. And so there's, I always joke that we live in a world of caveats when we're talking about data, because there's always some challenge with the data. And I'd just like to add real quickly to the person from Maryland, make sure to say hi to Alfred for me. He and I worked on the SDC steering committee for years together, and I miss hanging out with him.
Peter, do you wanna?
Yeah, I mean, I think I similar to what Michael was saying. The challenge is often that the thing that people want to measure, there isn't good data for it. And sorry,
Like potential
like the
displacement.
potential displacement. This is one that Lee and I have been working on. People want to know how many people in DC have been displaced from their neighborhood. Well, really isn't a good data source for that. There's other data source. So again, what Michael was talking about, there may be adjacent data, there may be things that can be used that give you some part of that. And so working with your folks, your data folks, to help understand like what the data can tell you, what it can't tell you, kind of where that is right now. So And then, yeah, I think a key challenge, so we've actually, and when working to try to build capacity with groups sometimes, that has, you know, been very satisfying, but then sometimes those people leave.
Yeah, I
And
was thinking
these
the
are-
turnover.
These are small organizations, a lot of times we're working with, so that can be a challenge for us and for them. That it's hard for them to retain the capacity even once they build it.
That turnover is always an issue. And so this is one of those, you know, with an academic partner thing to be careful about. Are you working with an academic partner who's collecting data for a class project? Or are you working with an academic partner who understands the commitment to the community? I think those are really two different things. The other challenge that I wanted to just bring up really quickly that feeds off of what Michael and Peter said is the challenge of data interpretation. You know, we've got this really diverse group of cross-sector partners, and I bet if we looked at specific data indicators, mixed them in a pot, we would all come up with a separate interpretation based on the lens that we're looking at that data through. And so just to be cognizant of that often you need the lived experience. You need that subjective information also coming from community to provide the context that is necessary to interpret the data that you're looking at, especially if you're doing neighborhood placemaking.
Great. Well, I think we are at the end of our time. Catherine, I will share your question with the panelists to try to get some insights offline. Please, if everyone could please join me in thanking the panelists for talking before we switch over to the rest of the agenda. Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much to Kathy and to all the speakers. We really appreciate that. I'll just introduce myself for anyone who doesn't know me. My name is Yvonne Marzuk. I work for the EPA in the Office of Community Revitalization. We are